I'm Joe Devine and welcome to Whiteboard Football Extra. A quick note before we get started with today's podcast. The series is now available to listen to on iTunes and Soundcloud as well as YouTube. If you're listening on YouTube, a link to our iTunes page will be provided in the description. High intensity, high pressing, high quality. Under Mauricio Pochettino, Tottenham Hotspur have morphed into a title-challenging side in the Premier League. Today, I'm joined by Alex Stewart to take a more in-depth look at Tottenham's tactics. Alex, the video highlights the two main formations used by Pochettino this season and how the team can situationally shift between the two during a match when necessary. This is something we haven't touched on too often in our Tactics Explained videos, but presuming that you have a technically proficient squad, shifting between different formations fluidly during a match is an option. If teams can do this, why do we so often see teams sticking to principles such as consistent number of players in defence or midfield, or if more potential benefit could be derived from a more fluid approach? So in the example with Tottenham today is that they can essentially shift between a 4 and a 3 at the back, with the fullbacks pushing up and the deeper central midfielder pulling back at times, right?
Yeah, I think there's two answers to this. The first is that Tottenham's squad is unusually well balanced for both approaches. The fullbacks, both sets of fullbacks, in fact the reserve fullbacks Trippier and Davis, I would include in this as well, are capable of playing as wing backs. So they can either play as fullbacks in a back 4, or they can play as wing backs either side of a back 3. You've also got in Wanyama and Eric Dyer players who are very capable of dropping back to that space, the half-back space in between the centre halves, and Dyer is a converted fullback or centre-back. So shifting to 3 at the back there for them is a lot easier. I think the way their squad is set up allows them to do it more naturally, because obviously you have to coach the transition between 3 at the back and 4 at the back, whether that's as a starting formation or something that you adapt to during a match. In terms of a more fluid approach, I think going forwards, if you look at Jonathan Wilson's Inverting the Pyramid, towards the end of that book, he talks about how 4-6-0 is potentially a sort of formation of the future, and that you have a back 4 that are pretty consistently such. And then ahead of that, you have 6 players who effectively can rotate and play in all the various positions. You'd probably have at least one central midfielder that sits, but you could look at Luciano Spalletti's Roma in 2007-8. You could look at the way that Alex Ferguson deployed a front 3 for Manchester United around the same sort of time, and you see that managers have sought to use a more fluid approach when their players are capable of doing that. So the interchange of positions, whether they are forwards, attacking midfielders, whether they are the ones that are bursting forward or dropping back. I think there's certainly a lot to be said for it, because it makes defending harder, particularly if people are taking a man-oriented approach. But you need to have good players. And if you don't have players that are capable of appreciating those nuances tactically, that are fit enough, perhaps that have already played in a number of different positions across the course of their career, then while it might be something that would be really nice for a team to do, it's something that they'll struggle with.
It's interesting that you talk about Jonathan Wilson's ideas about tactics in the future. I mean, I think when we look at setups like Tottenham's, it seems to me almost as if the team can be broken down into 2 blocks either side of the central midfielders. So, I mean, presumably the front 4, or maybe even the front 5, if we can use one of those central midfielders, can only interchange as frequently as they do, because the central midfielders are filling in the gaps and shoring up against counter-attacks. And on the flip side, the central midfielders can only be afforded time to focus, almost solely on those duties if the front players are talented enough to create opportunities at times independently of those central midfielders. And so I suppose with that in mind, you touched on it just there. I think is it that a talented squad is essential for developing that type of tactic? I mean, it sounds like it's not the sort of thing that we could maybe see recreated with a less technically minded team, or perhaps more generally teams lower down the leagues?
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I think talent isn't necessarily technique. And the two talents, or three talents really, that are required for this style of football are peak levels of fitness, which you also bring in because Pochettino is a high pressing manager, so obviously you need to have the fitness to press as well. You need technique in terms of being able to be particularly a central midfielder who can push forwards and control the ball when there's less room to manoeuvre because you're playing closer to the back four. And you need a tactically intelligent squad so that if a player's pushing forward, then another player knows to drop back. If a player's cutting in from wide, then the fullback knows there's room to move forwards. These are all complex skills, and they require teams to be together, train together for extended periods of time. You couldn't suddenly, I don't think, sweep into a side that weren't used to doing that sort of style and in the course of a couple of months get them doing it, even if they were very technically capable. I mean, you look at the issues that Pep Guardiola has had at Manchester City, trying to get this sort of positional play, interchanging play going with them. You know, that no one would say that the Manchester City squad was full of technically incompetent players, but it's taken a significant period of time to get them to understand the tactical side of it, the positional side of it. I think that's why, if you look at teams that have done this consistently well over maybe the past 6-7 seasons, you're looking at teams like Barcelona, where that style, that ability to interchange, to play in various positions, is bred into those players right from the very beginning, so that they have the technique to defend suitably, but they can also push forward. They can control the ball. They work almost instinctively. They work those kind of passing triangles that allow players to push forward in front of them. And that style develops because they have been coached in it since they were 6 or 7 years old at La Masia. And I think that's one of the things that we have to remember with Spurs is just how quickly, really, Pochettino has both got a team playing this style, but also how quickly he's incorporated the people who've only been at that team for maybe 2 or 3 seasons. It's quite remarkable.
Can we look at Tottenham's near future then? I mean, you talked about how one of the elements that those players are required to have for that tactic to make sense and to work on the pitch is to be at peak fitness. And so if we look at Tottenham's squad now, I suppose aside from their pulling power when they get into the transfer market and stuff, they have an excellent squad there already. I think one of the most impressive things about Tottenham's squad is the depth in fullbacks. And I think one commenter, I can't remember who it was, on the YouTube video, fairly made the point that both Trippier and Davies, would probably be starters in most other Premier League teams in terms of their quality in that position. But if we look at the next few years, we're talking about peak fitness. Do we think then that there's a timeline in which Tottenham need to, I suppose, hit their peak in terms of the quality of the team, what they're going to be able to do before some of those players get a little bit older, or I suppose the risk is it's going to be difficult to replace some of them with like for like players or players who have the same levels of quality and ability. Do you think the next 3 or 4 years we need to see Tottenham hit their stride in terms of winning the league, winning cups, or it might not happen?
I think that's fair. I think it's very, very difficult to look at, say, if you compare football with rugby, for example. Rugby with the World Cup works on 4-year cycles internationally, but say, for example, the Six Nations, there's a year-by-year thing. So you can cycle players' fitness, you can work up to a peak and have them ready to go for a 1-month period or a 2-month period every year. Across the course of a season, you have to keep at least a core group of your players fit from August right the way through till May. And that is much, much harder, particularly when you're playing a high-pressing style. And that's why, if you look at coaches like Marcelo Bielsa or Jurgen Klopp to an extent, there's often a fall-off in performance of the teams that they manage towards the end of a season. I think that's probably one of the reasons why Jurgen Klopp maybe struggles when it comes to winning cups, because cups fall at the end of seasons often. So, players are pretty exhausted by the time they get there. So depth of squad is crucial. And in that regard, I think, yes, Spurs do currently have a lot of strength in crucial positions. I also saw an interesting tweet thread earlier from at Unfit for Purpose, who's a stats person, talking about Tottenham's recruitment and how they are still effectively in England, even though they finished second in the league last season. They'll probably do the same again this season. They're not punching at the same weight in terms of their recruitment potential as certainly Chelsea, Manchester City, arguably Manchester United, Arsenal and Liverpool as well. So his advice, which I think is actually quite savvy, is to target people like Toby Alderweireld, who would deem surplus to requirements at sides that are almost the best in their country, but not quite. Alderweireld was on loan for a season at Southampton and did very well, so he was a doubly sensible acquisition because he'd been proved in the Premier League on loan for one season, but then Atletico Madrid were quite happy to let him go. I think what that does is that causes Spurs, if they're looking in that sort of market, because they're not going to be able to buy a Gareth Bale or a Cristiano Ronaldo or a Lionel Messi or a Mbappe or whoever else. It focuses them on acquiring exactly the right sort of player for the right sort of money, and also chucking a significant amount of what they do have financially into tying players into long-term contracts. And that intelligence of acquisition means that they aren't pressured to make the marquee signing. When you've got Arsenal fans clamouring to say, you must sign the best attacking midfielder again, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the right player to buy. And I think what Pochettino can do is he can sit there and say, right, actually what we need is a very specific type of central midfielder, a very specific type of centre-back. And by scouting intelligently, scouting using metrics and not trying to just buy a big name, then he can probably keep that style of recruitment going.
It's interesting that, and I think, teams like Arsenal, Manchester United, I suppose, are an example, City and Chelsea as well. They're in a position where often supporters ask for those sorts of things and want the marquee signing. It's an indication that something's not going, to plan at the club. And I think in Tottenham's case, this season, obviously you say they finished second last season, but I think finishing second this season, it doesn't feel like an underachievement. I know there's lots of supporters of rival clubs who'll be quick to joke that Tottenham haven't won the league again, but I'm not really sure that that was ever the most realistic assignment. I think if you'd given Spurs at the end of last season the opportunity to finish second again this year, that's almost above expectations. So I think they're in a slightly unique position in the top four at the moment, where they're not really expected to be winning. So given that things are working on the pitch and given that there's a lot of trust in the manager, the fans, I suppose, aren't really clamouring for that kind of marquee signing. Talking of the squad, we've mentioned fullbacks briefly already, and we talk about them quite a lot on the podcast. And it seems that many high-use, in-vogue sort of formations require the very highest quality fullbacks to be successful. I want to ask you if Tottenham's fullbacks, if the whole squad impress you, and I wonder also a slightly different question, if the emergence of the importance of fullbacks in modern formations in the last, I suppose, 3 or 4 years, or maybe a little bit longer if you're looking outside of the Premier League, I wonder if that might, and the sorts of players who are playing in those positions, that could influence young people watching the game to want to be fullbacks when they grow up. I think we saw recently in the last decade or so a glut of central midfielders and players who play in that number 10 position, perhaps as a result of players like Wayne Rooney or a kind of a focus on attacking midfielders. And I think you see that coming through even as recently as players like Dele Alli, and I wonder if you think maybe, given that fullbacks seem to be so integral to a lot of modern formations, whether we might start to see in the next 5 or 10 years the same sorts of players coming out in that position.
Yeah, quite possibly. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about to me, if I look back at the Premier League, the first pair of fullbacks who were really exciting and attacking in the way that you might describe a modern fullback to be were Arsenal's Ashley Cole and Lauren, who neither of whom were defenders to start with. They were converted midfielders and wingers. And I think that there's a degree to which the modern fullback often is either a converted wide but more forward player, or is required to take on that role. And I think if you're a purist, an old school kind of observer of the game, you might even bemoan the fact that fullbacks possibly don't have defending as high on their list of priorities as they used to. I personally don't agree with that. I think that's a reductive view. But, fullbacks are now spending a lot of time, if you look at sort of average position maps for most top-level sides, you'll find that the fullbacks are at least around the halfway line. And for some sides in some games, they are even higher. It's not uncommon, particularly to see Walker and Rose for Spurs right up by the byline in a position that you might find a winger normally. I think that the generic shift to the 4-2-3-1 was part of this, because in that you either have a narrow attacking midfield three, or even if it's a bit wider, you're playing wingers on their wrong feet. So they were cut in. This was a kind of Arjen Robben style. That became very, very attractive. But in order to still provide width in that system, you needed fullbacks that were capable of getting forwards. And I think that's what has created this incredibly athletic, incredibly dynamic style of fullback play, where they are effectively wing backs from the start, and in many instances auxiliary wide midfielders or auxiliary wingers. Is that enough to inspire people to want to play that position? I don't know, because I don't. I guess people take up positions for different reasons, don't they? And it's still not very glorious. I think sometimes one of the things I like about what we do in these videos is we highlight aspects of teams' play that might have escaped a lot of notice. Where Spurs are concerned, obviously Dele Alli, Harry Kane and Christian Eriksen get a lot of the plaudits. But this system wouldn't work without the fullbacks, and I hope that the way that we made this video kind of highlights that and maybe encourages people to look at that more seriously.
As we say, Tottenham's title challenge is probably over now. We're recording this a few days after their defeat to West Ham. But for next season, Alex, presuming Tottenham are going to stick with the same sort of setup, what threatens them? How might teams look to adapt next season to, maybe even specifically counter Tottenham's threat?
I think if you look at, particularly if they're playing three at the back and the way Chelsea played three at the back, the obvious way to counter that is also to play three at the back yourself. It's something that some teams have done. We've seen Hull try it this season. We've seen Watford do it fairly consistently. Arsenal have tried it a few times, and it does give you a kind of man-for-man marking of that system. In terms of negating Tottenham properly, I don't know. I think the difficulty is in tracking that group of players that kind of coalesce up front and can interchange. So Dele Alli, Eriksen, Harry Kane, Son Heung-min, just working out a way of dealing with that threat, possibly by dropping deeper, possibly by pressing them more. It's Tottenham are a very good side, and there are people who get paid a lot of money to work out how to beat very good sides at football. And I don't think there's necessarily a straightforward answer that I could give you now. But targeting those danger men, I think Tottenham's issues, like any overachieving side or any side that consistently compete with the top four, because I don't think Tottenham are a top four side historically in that sense that we talk about in the Premier League, is retaining their players. I think the biggest threat to teams like Spurs are, and I would probably put Everton in this bracket, previously teams like Southampton as well, although they've not done well this season, the easiest way to beat them is almost off the pitch. It's to buy those players that make those sides work.
Liverpool's tactic.
Yeah, I mean, I think Liverpool are probably a bit more astute than just trying to do that. You know, they identify players that fit their system, apparently, because of this transfer cabal that they have. But you know, if somebody comes in with an astonishing offer for Dele Alli, or for Harry Kane, or for Kyle Walker, you know, there's talk of Walker and Man City being a possibility. Spurs still aren't in a position to compete financially, and those players know that they can make, you know, more money in terms of wages by going somewhere else. Tottenham have put them all on long-term contracts, which is why they would command pretty exorbitant fees. But then if you're looking at the Man Cities and the Man Uniteds of this world, they can pay exorbitant fees. And, you know, a player like Kyle Walker, you might be able to buy a very, very good right back, right wing back for 70 million or whatever Spurs would get for him. But it's having a player who can integrate into that system, who knows the players, who understands how Pochettino works, and it would take a very, very good player time to get up to speed. So, you know, I don't think Spurs are going to be asset stripped by any stretch of the imagination, because they're not Southampton, but that's where the threat will come, I think.
Okay, let's take a look at some of the user comments now. Well, to be honest, Alex, the comment section for this particular video was essentially full of people talking about bottles, or some variation of Tottenham bottling things. When I wrote this down, I wasn't aware that this was a thing. Someone had since told me that after Tottenham's defeat to West Ham, the presenter on the Sky Sports programme said something about Tottenham bottling it, and I think perhaps that's where people have picked this up. But I wasn't really... I didn't think this was a thing.
Is it a thing? Bottling is, I suppose, what somebody who is in analytics would refer to as an intangible. Something that can't be measured. A loss of confidence, or becoming flaky when the pressure is on. I personally think it's kind of ridiculous. I think that for whatever reason, particularly in the Premier League era, Spurs and Arsenal have got reputations for being flaky when it gets tough and bottling it, quote unquote. Spurs have pushed a very, very good Chelsea team, brilliantly coached by Antonio Conte, pretty much all the way this season. And both teams have dropped points. I think Chelsea went 10 games without keeping a clean sheet, and you know, lost at home. And this is, I think, if you're on the wrong end of those things come the end of the season, people will look back and go, it's because you bottled it, i.e. you lost confidence. But there's no real way of measuring that. I don't think you can necessarily look at a side and infer that is what has caused those results to happen. You know, sometimes West Ham played a very, very defensive kind of 3-5-2 in that game, or 3-4-2-1 really. They set up with a very, very strong, battling, gritty kind of midfield, and they ground out a victory. You know, if that had come halfway through the season, I don't think anyone would have noticed. It's a game in which a manager figured out a way of negating Tottenham by clogging up the midfield, and it worked because they didn't find an answer. That doesn't mean that Spurs bottled their title challenge.
So I suppose what we're saying is that it's a kind of unscientific way of filling in those intangibles. It may much in the same way that somebody might say religion is for answering the question of what happens after you die.
It's rather a heavy reference for a football podcast. But yes, I think to an extent it is. I mean, okay, look, you could look at certain things and maybe infer from those that there was some sort of psychological change that had occurred in the way a team was playing. So if a team had been converting shots at 15% across the course of a season until it got to the final 5 games, and they dropped to 5%, you might think that something had happened there. If they're creating chances at a huge rate and then that drops off, if they've not made any errors up until that point, and then all of a sudden their game is littered with errors, which are only measured if they lead to a shot or a goal, but you could possibly suggest that confidence is part of that. It could be tiredness, it could be a loss of confidence, it could be the teams that happen to be their opponents because of the way the fixture list is brought out. There might be teams that are set up in terms of their system or their squad to be a particular threat, and it happens that you play them at that particular time. Is it a thing? Possibly. Is it something that we can measure and be assertive about? I don't think so. And if you look at
I'm sorry.
That's all right. I was just going to say, if you look at the way Tottenham have played the rest of this season, I think it would be very hard to say that they're a team that had anything approaching a fragility of confidence.
It must be frustrating for statisticians, because I imagine, as a result of the way that the universe works, that data is available. We just don't have any way of gathering it or enough processing power to understand it, right?
By that data, you mean?
I mean, whether it's tiredness, whether it's confidence, there must be micro indicators for all of those things. But, with our current level of technology, we're unable to understand them.
Yeah, I mean, I know in terms of, you're probably getting into stuff like biochemistry there to indicate, how players are feeling. Maybe, you might be able to infer that from hormonal balance or something. I genuinely don't know enough about biochemistry, but I do know that in terms of data acquisition in sport, that the physiological aspect of it is kind of the next frontier. So already people have moved from talking about distance run into number of sprints and sprint intensity. And as things like GPS tracking, but also on-body in-game monitoring and in-training monitoring improve, I think we'll start to see that as a whole other data set that is available. But I think it would only be available to clubs. The information that's gathered by people like Opta or Gracenote, the sort of the in-game metrics of passes and chances and that kind of stuff, that can be available publicly in some sort of form. I think the stuff that's physiological and to do with how players are performing physically is that, clubs would lock that down.
You might run into some human rights issues there as well, I think, if you start to make those things publicly available.
Yeah, that's also very true.
Listerer Man says, I think you forgot about Dembele running through the midfield, passing to Dele Alli, Kane, Eriksen. Quite a lot of people mentioned Moussa Dembele. What does he bring to Tottenham's play, Alex, and why did you leave him out?
I left him out because these videos are between 5 and 6 minutes long, and you can't talk about everything. He could go into detail about such a degree of stuff, the passing range of Alderweireld or whatever. So some people don't make the cut. My apologies to all the Moussa Dembele fanboys out there and fangirls. He is obviously very important, as is every member of that side. It starts at the back with Lloris, it continues all the way through. So every player plays their role. Dembele is, I suppose he's a link between, if we're talking about those, a defensive unit and attacking unit, he's the bit that conjoins those two directly by carrying the ball and passing. He's hugely energetic, he's very good in the tackle. His positional play and his energy allow him to cover across if his central midfield partner does drop back into the half-back space. So yeah, he's crucial, absolutely. But as I would say and stress, with a team like Tottenham, every player from 1 till 11 is crucial to the way they play. So I can't, because of time constraints and stuff, I can't include everybody in every video. My apologies for that.
The Walter Samuel 21 says that the halfback is genuinely one of the greatest positions in football. We used this word when we referred to Eric Dyer in a specific circumstance. Do you agree? Do you like a halfback, Alex?
Who doesn't like a halfback, Joe? So a halfback is in terms of nomenclature, it comes from right the way back from the 2-3-5. The fullbacks were the two that were closest to the goalkeeper, and then the halfbacks were three players in the space between them, a wide halfback on either side who then became a fullback as position shifted, and the central halfback who, depending on which team it was, took on either kind of a purely destructive role or something that almost anticipated the kind of the sweeper libero style, so that, carrying the ball up into the midfield or raking long range passing. I would encourage people who've not read Jonathan Wilson, the Inverting the Pyramid book, to look at this, because he's particularly good on that kind of early style of football and positions like the halfback. I quite like it because I think it's, there's a defensive role there, but there's also a kind of almost a quarterback role in terms of passing the ball long. They need to have great positional awareness, and you can see how players like, for example, Makaleli in the screening role that he performed for Real Madrid and Chelsea was sort of a halfback. Dyer does it, but then you get more passing halfbacks. Someone even, say, like Andrea Pirlo, sort of occupies that position without the defensive work. So yeah, there's a lot in that position, and it can be very interesting to look. It's one of those positions that if it's played well, it can make the rest of the team tick.
Ronaldo Owino says, if Spurs played the 60-plus matches Man United are playing with that high-pressing tactic, I can guarantee you that they would be nowhere near close to the top four. The commenter goes on to mention tiredness. We've talked about that a little bit already. And he also mentions Europe, which is the final thing on my list for us to discuss, Alex, because lots of commenters are asking about Tottenham's poor performance in the Champions League. What do you think about that, and why do you think that's so different from their performances in the Premier League?
So they played their European games, their home games at Wembley, which does, I think, have a negative impact in terms of atmosphere, so that there is always that, and that'll be an issue for them going forwards when the White Hart Lane Stadium move occurs. In terms of their Champions League group, they had Monaco in that group, who I think surprised everybody with how well they did, beaten semi-finalists. Bayer Leverkusen are a very handy side as well, and finishing third in that group was actually, I don't think that was particularly bad. And then their knockout by Ghent in the Europa League, a lot of that was probably to do with the Dele Alli red card in the first half in the home leg of that tie. So there is something to be said for the fact that they kind of were unlucky in Europe this time round. I do think that they are one of the more tactically intelligent sides in English football. So it wouldn't surprise me if they went on to do well in Europe. I think Europe is, it has to be viewed almost, it is a cup competition, but, it's a series of discrete games that pose very unusual tactical conundrums. And it requires a very different way of thinking about how to play than the kind of ebb and flow of a whole season where you can rotate players, you can rest players, you're facing teams that you're much more used to facing, and that you can see playing your opponents that might play in a similar style much more regularly. And I think the focus, English football, I think is quite insular, and this is maybe why managers like Pochettino or Wenger previously can, because they're more outward looking, they might have a greater appreciation of what's happening. But it's, you're being posed tactical challenges that you don't come across all that regularly. So I think a side needs to mature into that and get used to that sort of thing. So Tottenham will be almost certainly in the Champions League next season, and I would expect them to do a lot better if they can hold on to those key players, because it requires experience, it requires maturity. I think it's something that we don't stress enough about this Tottenham side is how young some of their key players are. Euro 2016, Dele Alli and Eric Dyer both qualified for the UEFA Young Player cut-off, which I think was about 22 and a bit at the time that the tournament was played. Harry Kane's barely a year older than that. And many of them have been at the side for at most 3 seasons. They haven't had, relatively speaking, they're not an old and experienced side, and they haven't been playing together for as long as some of the other teams that have progressed further in Europe have done. So I think give them time. I don't necessarily think it's all that much to do with pressing, although there is an argument to say that you need to kind of grow into fitness, and they're perhaps not quite as match fit at the beginning of the season to play in that style from the off. But I wouldn't bet against them to do much better next season.
Okay, before we go, one last thing for us to announce. Alex, myself, and Paul Ansorge will be combining over the summer period, the off-season for Premier League fans, on a campaign about the history of the World Cup. So some of Alex's tactical videos will be dedicated to examining the evolution of tactics from 1930 all the way up to modern day, and in those tactical eras, Paul Ansorge is going to be picking out his favourite tournaments and creating brief history of videos to complement those as well. Some of the podcasts during that time will also likely be about that. So if you do have any questions or any comments about your favourite World Cup or anything you'd like us in particular to cover, you can get in touch now and let us know. You can do that in the comments on this video, or you can follow us on Twitter at uMAXit Football, also uMAXit Football on Facebook, and do visit the editorial site as well, uMAXit.com, because there's 5 or 6 fabulous articles going out every day there, and we'd love you to read them. So Alex Stewart, thank you very much, and I'll speak to you again soon.
Thank you, Joe.